Hi, welcome or welcome back to the Scarlet Quill Society. This is our November meeting, which we are squeaking in just under the wire on November 30th. It's December in some parts of the world already. Sorry, guys. November is, as you may have noticed, kind of a hard month to get people together in. There are a lot of holidays. There are a lot of family commitments. There's my birthday. And so I'm really, really grateful to both Genevra and Kat for finding time to join us today and talk about the death of the author. But before we do that, I do want to say, because it is November and because we are thinking about, especially here in the US where Yeah Right is based, about settler colonialism, about conversations about indigeneity, about the debts that we owe to people, and what it means to be a settler on Indigenous land when Indigenous people are very much present here and now. We do want to acknowledge that the nexus of Yeah Right sits on the traditional and current home of the Multnomah, the Wasco, Cowlitz, Klamath, and Clackamas people, as well as the bands of Chinook, the Tualatin, Calapooya, and Malala, and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. So to acknowledge that, and because an acknowledgement without action is not effective, Yeah Right donates to the Naya Family Center, which provides culturally specific programs and services to guide people in the direction of personal success and balance through cultural empowerment. And I know Giving Tuesday is over in the US, but you might think about where, if you have some money this holiday season, you can put some funds towards empowering indigeneity, either locally or worldwide. And I'm going to invite our guests to give their own land acknowledgements. Kat, do you want to go first? I know you were talking about being prepared. This is what you get.
As has been traditional for me recently, I am not going to give a specific land acknowledgement because it's a little too revealing about where I am, and because of the work I do, I try to actually be somewhat obscure. What I am going to note is that I am a child of settlers living on occupied land, and that would be true anywhere that I was within the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or many other places around the world. And for those of you within reach of our voices, it's also true that even if you are not a person living on settled, occupied land, you may very well be the beneficiary of a culture that participated in that kind of thing. If you are not, if you're an Indigenous person watching this, I hope we do right by you. We're talking. Please come talk to us about joining in our panels. We want to hear your voice.
Yes, please.
Um,
Find us on Discord, on Twitter. Are we still on Twitter? I can't remember if we're still on Twitter because it's like the end days. But definitely on Discord. You can find us on our website, on YouTube, leave us comments. We have all kinds of contact options. We would love to hear from you.
And that, yeah, no, my family did not do the day that I'm calling Genocide Appreciation Day this year. I also did not actually say that out loud to anybody on the day. I don't know whether that was me being nice or me being too tired, which is a problem. I'm inviting everybody to get enough sleep, get enough water, get enough food, take care of your health so that you can yell when it's necessary.
And I'm actually going very specific today. I live currently in Roanoke, Virginia, which is the ancestral home of the Isong and land which was also hunted by the Saponi and the Occaneechi peoples. The city, which is named for the shell beads the peoples in this area used for decoration and currency, was built with the wealth acquired through the labor of enslaved people. And several of the local streets are still named directly after this hateful, evil practice. And on a very personal note, I'm sitting in the basement of a 140-year-old home on a street named for the building's owners, a street in a neighborhood through which you can still see the 120-year-old trees that those owners planted when this building was the center of a tree farm. And I've spent the last month looking at those trees while the leaves fall, and thinking how the owners of those properties do not know who planted them or why. And thinking a lot about how you can be in a place and see how the landscape you move through is visibly changed by the choices of the people who came before you, and not necessarily recognize their motivation, not necessarily recognize that this is not the way it naturally was, and how conscious we have to be about starting to recognize the choices of the people who were here before us, and starting to recognize how our own choices bolster or heal the effects of those people and pass similar effects down to the people who are coming after us.
If I had scripted that, I could not have asked for a better intro to this month's subject. I absolutely could not have, because this month we are talking about the death of the author, which is the concept, the idea that you can appreciate or enjoy or consume. And I think consume is probably the right word here, and we'll get to why I think that in a second, but that you can consume media without having to engage with the creator as a person on any level. And so it's people from, folks writing fanfic who grew up with Harry Potter and are like, well, Rowling no longer owns this. This is our space now, and it's trans friendly now, and it's inclusive now, and Hermione is Black now. To people who are like, Beethoven was the greatest composer ever lived, and the ninth is just like, I listen to that and I'm completely in my happy space, and ignore that Beethoven was an abusive uncle who essentially like stole his nephew and gaslit him into like horrible mental illness. I think I have that right. So like, but on the flip side, if you dig hard enough, you're gonna find something that you don't like about anyone, literally anyone. Yes, anyone. And the level of what you don't like versus what you don't tolerate versus what does harm in the world, these are also conversations that we need to be having, because like, oh, it upsets me that this person pronounces GIF is really different from it upsets me that this person writes every antagonist in their book as fat. Still looking at you, Joe Rowan. So like, and I'm thinking of that specific example because there's a thing that's going around where she's talking about, oh, I don't want my little girls to grow up in a fat phobic society, and yet she contributes to a fat phobic society and she builds a fat phobic society. But what do we talk about? And so I was trying to think about, before Jennifer gave me like this perfect intro, how we would get into this and how we would start talking about it. And I came across and I genuinely don't remember if it was an Instagram or on Facebook or TikTok, or it's a vertical format short video that's probably cross posted to a million platforms. And this guy's talking about death of the creator, and he says, well, it would be impossible to know everything about every creator. And so is that a valid stance? Like, he's like, well, you can't just like look everybody up because they came on your Pandora shuffle.
I think a lot comes down to obviously the amount of treasure, the amount of work that you're willing to put into it. But I also think that you don't have to look up every author and every creator. You have to be on the lookout. It's not a matter of, I have to do a deep dive before I decide whether or not I'm going to, whether this work is pure enough for me to consume it. It's a matter of how willing you are upon being presented new information to pivot, or whether you're going to dig in your heels instead. And whether I think that would, whether you change how you respond to a work, how you consume a work, how you assist in disseminating that work, depending on the new information you get, rather than whether your information is perfect to start.
Oh, I want to talk about two parts of that. One of which is, I think it's important to remember why you want to look at these things and think about it, because the question is, what are you absorbing through your fiction? What is it teaching you to think of as unexceptionable, normalized, routine, expected, right? Because there are all sorts of things that our stories are teaching us, whether we acknowledge them or not. Right now, I've been spending most of this month composing an essay about how I think that we have too much of a desire to wait for a superhero because we're not consuming enough stories about coming together and figuring out how to deal, and that the apocalyptic stories we have are all about guns and zombies, which is its own problematic genre. And the other thing here is that, it's not about have you done exhaustive research on everybody? It's about the fact that for those of you who are not familiar with my work, apart from when I show up for Scarlet Quill Society, I do a lot of public writing about current topics. And occasionally I will share a thing from somebody, and my commentariat will come to me and say, hey, maybe you don't want to share that person. Here's a better link for the same content. That person's kind of, and so because of my reputation, I do get more things than the average person is likely to get. However, there's a question of this didn't just happen by magic. I have a reputation because this is what I'm known for doing. This is a thing that I have gathered around me. I have people who are going to tell me these things. And also I seek these things out even beyond what I already have access to. That doesn't mean I don't get it wrong. That doesn't mean I don't end up being surprised. I'm quote overly online. I still don't know everything. I'm not expecting anyone else to know everything either. It's a question of what do you do at the moment that you're told, hey, you can double down, or you can go, oh. And the question is, why do you do that? And I think that's the important thing, because all the people who are objecting and going, well, I can't do that. Well, why are you objecting? Right?
Well, and what do
And
we
part of this
routinely
is
know about creators that we like, right? Like, because I think that if you look at like K-pop fandom, if you look at whatever people are calling Taylor Swift's people anymore, or
aren't
Beyonce,
they
or
still Swifties?
are they still Swifties? I don't know.
Generally, but there are some subgroups.
Okay.
Okay. Not my fandom. I feel
I
like
I
it's
have friends in a fandom where the artist's shoe size has become known and everybody's excited about it. People know about all sorts of details.
right. So like we do routinely go out and get information about artists that we're engaging with, about media that we're engaging with.
So when we say we, I think we should actually acknowledge that those of us who engage with our content with a very strong not death of the author context are more likely to do that than the people who want their stuff to come out of some kind of faceless tap of entertainment. And that if you are in that sort of it doesn't matter who did it, then you're very unlikely to engage with that and to not know. But at that point, what I want to ask is, how do you know that what you're consuming isn't some kind of propaganda that's asking you to think about things that in ways that you might not want to, that's influencing you? Because everything we see influences to do something. And does it matter to you whether or not your story was written by a robot?
Well, and I think both of you are editors, or have been editors, have engaged with work on a meta level, let's call it. Even if you've known nothing about the author, you've been given a piece of work and you can tell things about the author from the work, right? You can tell what's important to them, even if they're not explicitly writing an essay saying fat people are evil.
Everybody, you cannot tell a story about somebody else without telling on yourself. And sometimes the things you're telling on yourself are, you had a great relationship with your mom, or you feel a particular way about mornings. But even if you are writing fiction, and even if you are distancing yourself and your own experiences, it is very difficult to tell a story that isn't still framed by them.
One of the things I've said a lot is that most of us are very careful about what we're portraying. We are much less careful about what we're not portraying. Who's missing from your story? And these things are often the tells, because I get asked a lot because in the past I've done consulting work for finding sensitivity readers or cultural consultants or finding diversity for panels. And I get asked, well, can't somebody do enough studies so that they do a really respectful job? And yes, if you're doing that kind of portraying somebody that you're unfamiliar with, you should do that. But I've mentioned over and over again that, it's very easy to just create a checklist of these are the things that if I say these things, it will reveal this kind of whateverness. And the one that remains this vivid story in the circles that I'm around is American Dirt, where the author was not from the culture that she was portraying. She had a checklist, and people started questioning because there were tells within the story and how it was told that made it very clear to people who are within that culture that this was not being told by an own voice's perspective. And there is a caution there because people do get coerced into telling stories in a way that suits a mainstream gaze, so that you include the things that you put in italics, that you put in glossaries when you wouldn't necessarily for your own community. But even so, there's a difference between coming from having lived that world versus performing that world to a checklist.
For me, obviously, a lot of my own internal, my personal metaphor tends to default to the martial arts. And my spouse is a martial arts teacher of decades of experience, practice himself. And it has always been very interesting to me to watch him with a new student who's coming from another school, because that student might know how to throw a pretty good punch and they might know how to do a pretty good, straight high block or whatever, but they don't know this school. And so they don't know their own vulnerabilities.
Mm.
And to him, who is deeply immersed in so many arts, and this one in particular, everything they don't know is visible just from looking. He can ask them to do a simple form, and everything they don't know that they don't know just is so visible that he can make it visible to me by reaching over and fixing an elbow or touching an ankle or straightening a shoulder. And you can get somebody who wants very badly to do kung fu and watches every video they can find and reads every book that they can find, and they still don't know what they're missing. And it is deeply visible to the people who have actively practiced.
I come at this from a dance perspective, and it's really interesting watching somebody who is expert in one dance language doing something else. The only time I got to see Mikhail Baryshnikov perform live was with White Oak Dance Company, and he was doing modern dance where he comes from this deep, deep ballet background. Every bit of his ballet training shows, even when he's doing choreography on modern performers. And this is a thing that, not just from that elite level, I remember watching a performance in Tahiti where there's a dance in Tahiti called the tamore, which is a cultural treasure. But when those kids who'd grown up within this dance idiom were doing a Dances of the World showcase, I think it was for a school, everything they did had a tamore accent to it because it affects the way you move your body in the same way that many of us have an accent in the other languages we speak, because it has to do with how you move your mouth and how your brain processes sounds as you hear them. And these are very mechanical things we're talking about, but this also affects how a writer writes. It affects how an editor edits, and it affects how the reader reads or how the viewer sees. We cannot escape our context. It's where we're standing. I talk about social parallax, where the concept of parallax in the original form of the word is that things that are further away and things that are closer move differently as you go past them. And I use it to mean where you are standing makes things look different because of the gaze that you have, the direction that you're looking from, where you're standing from to look at other things. I don't think that it's possible to have any kind of neutral death of the author. It's just a thing, except that we are trained in the education we receive when we have a not diverse education to assume that one particular thing is a neutral voice and everything else is ethnic or queered or all these other things, which are all about distance from this massive black hole center of this is the thing. But
Right.
human existence is only the thing because of an artificial imposition of global historical um, imperialism and all these other movements that have really, really affected how people experience and what they're taught is normal, human, or right, or anything else.
So pivoting just a little bit, I want to talk about when we talk about uh death of the author. Let's flip and look at it from an authorial standpoint rather than a consumptive standpoint, and say, like, when I'm telling a story, I put things in that I want my reader to take away, right? There's an assumption that we and the reader are coming to this story, and less so in written traditions than in oral traditions, but that we are coming to this story to collaborate. We are coming from for the same reasons, that I'm telling the story. And it's one of the reasons that we talk about the editor's job being super important, so that you can make sure that you're telling the story that you think you're telling, instead of telling on yourself as much as you maybe are. But also, like, just to ensure, because you want the reader to take things away, right? Like, you're putting things in, you're putting a lot of your creativity in, you're putting a lot of your creative process in and your ideas. And so for the reader to be like, well, none of that exists, I'm going to take away from this work what I feel like taking away from the work. Is it the same work? Can it be the same work if you and the reader are there for really different purposes?
I think it is not probably possible to only take what you want. You can make a lot of choices about, this is what I'm going to think on, this is what I'm going to, internalize into my own work somehow. But I think it isn't possible to utterly excise everything else, because you can't pay attention to all of it on such a detail that you can discard it.
Right, like when you're borrowing the concept of goblins to put in your work, what are you bringing with you?
You're just going to pick up shading, you're going to pick up tone, you're going to pick up a slight different color in your palette. Even if you are approaching something very critically, if you use it to then inform your worldview, there's a good chance that you've got a little bit of an extra passenger on the way.
So I am now lost in whether we're talking about a creator trying to bring in tropes or whether we're talking about the reader and what the reader's taking away. Because as a consumer or participant in media, I often find myself taking things away that were not intended. There is, I'm not going to name, I may not name the particular media that I'm thinking about right now, but there's a thing that is pushed at me constantly. It is the pinnacle and the best of storytelling, and it's the greatest. And I keep trying, and every time I look at that, I'm like, it's a bunch of white people having white people worldviews, and all I can see is that, and this is a visual thing, is that all of the participants of color are aliens, right? And this happens a lot. And so what I'm getting out of that story is not what the producer and the various other creatives were intending out of that. I am seeing a thing that is coming at this from my position, my parallax, my gaze on this, my expectations and my needs. So there's that. There's also the fact that, as you're telling the story, even the way you're telling the story is affected by your cultural framework, right?
So I wanted to talk about both of those things, actually, both what you brought up and what Jennifer brought up. But it's I think the question then becomes, when you are approaching that piece of media, I can think of so many examples that you might be thinking of. So we're gonna call it Lord of the Treks. So when you watch Lord of the Treks and you get that out of it, can you, like, you might be getting something really valuable out of it. You might be getting something really interesting out of it. Oh, I really missed a chance to call it Lord of the Fireflies, didn't I? Anyway,
You also missed an opportunity to call it, Trek of Babylon.
oh, so many things it could be. Star rings.
So many things.
But I know a lot of people, I hesitate to say us, although I am a member of communities that have been historically marginalized, but like I'm not living in that marginalization here and now. I'm really not where I am. But a lot of people have been so hungry for any representation at all that they're going to go ahead and watch Lord of the Treks and identify with the character and enjoy it. But then can you, death of the author, can you turn around and recommend it and say, I really identify with Wharfdo, I think you should watch Lord of the Treks?
So one of the things that I've ended up with in these kinds of things is also critiquing and also appreciating and understanding the context of queering the fiction, right? Or appreciating the villain coding. And right now it's really popular to identify with the villain. But I've then had to go back and ask people, when you're identifying with a villain, what is that doing to you, right? And what is that doing to other people? Because when you are in a position of being marginalized and being hungry, I was a huge Firefly fan. I was. Because there were so few East Asian people portrayed at all in the media that I loved, because I could have looked at Sourceland media, but that wasn't speaking to me either. And by Sourceland, for people who are watching and don't understand that, I mean the places in which people in diaspora originate from, so that they are not seen as other in those places. So for Japanese Americans, that would be Japan, for instance, or people from the Chinese diaspora, that is some part of China. So I watch Firefly, but it's a world where people like me are just barely even set dressing. What I found was, when I revisited it decades later, I realized that it was even more problematic, but that I've been training myself to see myself in a situation, which is not the thing that people in the catered to communities are doing. Because we know this now, when we do a little bit of race bending, we do a little bit of gender bending in the casting, the people in the masses freak out. So they are not engaging in this sort of neutral, take from the story what you will frame, right? If the queer characters are always the villains, that is affecting the world. If things are always shot in that, that sepia, this is a destroyed world light, it affects how people see things. If it's always in that very blue, crisp, this is civilization light, it affects how people see things. And people really end up in this, oh, well, yeah, it's sad that those people are getting bombed, but they live in the bombed place. So I don't, yes, we need, I'm not trying to grab stories out of people's hands. I try to stop myself and other people from saying just. What I want to do is to get people to be aware, even for your escapist stuff, be mindful about what it's training you to. And also, when you're writing things, what are you training other people to that you're not even thinking about? Do you want to be part of that machine?
So
what
by
have
that,
you been trained to overlook as an author, so it's getting into your work, so it's getting to your readers?
So by that framing, I guess, I tend to try and look at effect as more than just damage or benefit, because of course it's so much more complex than that. I can take from a story that someone else finds deeply emotionally damaging to them, I can take something that makes me stronger, or vice versa, definitely. But so I guess then any discussion has to inevitably return to representation, because it's a lot easier to say, well, this is an imperfect author and they did some things I disagree with on a moral level, but I can take a little bit of good from this story, when there's 50 others of a similar shape, from a similar author, a similar background, a similar representation. Whereas if we're dealing with, well, for instance, I'm Filipino American. I am married into a Chinese American family, Taiwanese American family, excuse me. But growing up, my and my sib's favorite Disney movie was Mulan. We are not Chinese, but that was the closest we could get to seeing anybody who looked even a little bit like us in a Disney movie. So while that movie is deeply flawed, did a lot of things that would not fly today, it's the best we had, so we seized on it. So I think that, once again, it just has to come down, I suppose, to, you can give some authors more slack, maybe, if there are a bunch more to choose from. If they are not the single soul, you're the only person who's trying to do this work right now, kind of position, which again isn't necessarily fair to a person who's just trying to tell a story and they come from a flawed place.
I mean, this is the thing that I went to Japan for the first time in many, many, many decades last month and a half ago. And, it's really different when it's a really complete world where people have been there for thousands of years and the stories that are being told are rooted in centuries and centuries of context, where the portrayal is that somebody could be of a particular demographic, can be the most fucked up person ever, and that it's just that person, that is an individual character and not an archetype, right, of anything other than that character set, rather than of that demographic, which is very different. And it's interesting that you bring up Mulan, because for me, Mulan was, oh God, here we go again. Because I'd grown up in a context of exoticized East Asianness, and so it was, oh look, she's got the super snidey eyes and everything else. And then I was at a convention full of POC, and I was talking to people who've grown up in a more Chinese diaspora context, who were like, oh, but Hua Mulan is this amazing story. And for them, it's part of a dialogue with an entire series of other work that has been created in this. And so this is a character that for them is really, really close to the heart. And, we had Hua Mulan viewing parties and really got recontextualized into the entire context of that story and why that story is what it is within that cultural sphere, which was mind-blowingly different for me, even though that's a really adjacent place. And that, it was, for some of my friends in that community, oh, Disney is seeing us, even, and they're doing that thing where they mess up the story, because none of Disney's stories are true to their sources. And so for them it was, oh yeah, it's just not true to the source. And so it's absolutely about where you're standing. And I can see how, so for my generation, it was Snow White. Oh my God, she's not blonde. Because I'm old. And wow, now there's a story, and that's like rife with colorism, skin as white as snow. But it was the fact that her hair was dark that made us so excited.
I remember
because we've been told that
even when
fairy
I was
princesses were blonde
and white, and in a context of whiteness, I remember being so hungry for any brunette protagonist. Like, that was all I was asking, was just one non-blonde. I got 4, but just one was all I needed. Which also tells you when and where I grew up. But it was a lot. Like, the fact that you get songs like The Cruel Sister, or the Bonnie Swans, where like you have the younger, fairer sister, and this is the protagonist, and that's it. She can either be a protagonist or a murder victim. Those are her choices. But The older sister, the darker sister, has no choices whatsoever. She's the antagonist. She's either the murderer or she's going to try. And what does that do to you, as Jennifer was saying, as Kat was saying, when the only representation you have of yourself is the villain? And so can you, if an author continually puts that in their work, can you then say, well, here is an author, do you want to continually say, here is a body of work that has a lot of CJK people, that has a lot of Indigenous people, that has a lot of Black people in it? Or do you say, so go ahead, take this and write your fanfic? Or do you want to look at this as a body of work by an author that literally only puts POC in as antagonists?
I mean,
That's too many concepts.
I get the flip side a lot. I get people going, oh, this show is so diverse. And what it means is, I call it kids programming casting, where there's one of each.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
call it Disney casting, but yeah, it's
I
nothing about their
I
backgrounds.
literally did grow up in that context because I come from that first generation of integrated suburbs. But that's a messed up story, especially because the protagonist is either might as well be white or is actually white. And that's very United Colors of Benetton. It's very superficial, but it's not the same as, we're going to acknowledge that people come in all sorts of different sizes and that you might need your inseam to be different lengths, right? I cannot rent a public bicycle. I'm too short everywhere because people of my inseam are not allowed to ride bicycles, apparently. So, you know, how am I supposed to death of the author into a world where I exist? And the thing is, if I don't exist in the imagination, then people who are playtesting, people who are doing Q&A, people who are designing don't even see that I might need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized a while back, I was like, why did the chairs all get so tall all of a sudden? I realized what happened was I had kids and I stopped wearing platform shoes all the time. And when I was traveling, I came across a ridiculously good sale for platform Crocs. And I remembered why I stopped wearing platforms when I was chasing children, because, oh, right, it's easy to turn your ankles because you've got a different kind of leverage now. But, all of a sudden the chairs are the right height for me. But I'm having to pay the cost in order to make the chairs the right height, as opposed to there being footstools by default, because maybe some people have short legs. And this is a world building issue, literally how the world is built, as opposed to just how a story is constructed. And so this has impacts everywhere. And if only pretty people can be star actresses and love interests, and it has a huge impact. And it's really interesting hearing people who are not from the US talking about how very plastic Americans are. We all have good teeth. We don't, but that's how we're portrayed. How we're all a certain kind of look. And I grew up in LA, where that's more true than not, because everybody who does look like that swarms to LA wanting to get cast. Mm-hmm. And I go to other parts of the world and I'm like, oh, people have such diversity of appearance. And then you look at the media that comes out of those places, and in fact, they're casting also because that's the world they're in, and there isn't a push to try to create this fascist image of there's only these beautiful people. There's more diversity in the media as well. But you can, I think, I will need to come up with some studies. When you look, as a culture becomes more and more right-wing and fascist, their media follows suit with this sort of Ubermensch look. But the worst of that for the last 100 years has been Hollywood. It matters. And so it matters when we tell our stories. What details do we give people? And when we're people who've consumed that kind of media, we have a tendency to make a romance novel full of beautiful people, or to exceptionalize the homely one. And this is a story of how the homely one got a boyfriend, which is kind of the anti-lookist, right? It's the anti-lookist version of disability inspo porn.
right? Or like, is your Mary Sue a perfect elf, or is she just like you but gonna get all the things you don't?
Right.
Like, how does that work?
Which again so strongly becomes how we tell on ourselves as a writer,
Yeah.
those things that
So
get highlighted or don't.
um somebody brought up, I mean, we have a question, which is about what we were talking about with Disney casting, or this one, that one, the other one, and backgrounds. What about media that started out like white, all these characters are white, and then they plugged in POC? And I know Wheel of Time has been brought up as an instance of that. I know that, oh, what's it, the one that's set in like Russia and China? Why can I not? It's the
Are we
A
talking
Noun of
about
Noun and
The Man in the
Nouns.
High Castle?
No, but that probably too. Like, does that make it better? Is that death of the author? Is inserting this um casting and rewriting, does that actually create a death of the author situation where you're now essentially consuming a piece of media without whatever the original problem was? Or like, does that fix it? And I know what my answer is, but nobody wants to hear my answer.
I think, obviously it depends on which Reddit forum you're perusing at the time. Wheel of Time in specific has so many people so angry, where I have just been gobbling it down with delight. It's not that there aren't many of the same flaws the original material had. It's not that there aren't all new flaws added now, but it's just so much fun to see all these people getting roles that I have never seen people of color be allowed to act in an American production before, ever. Getting complexity and uncertainty and anger that is not typically allowed to be exposed in a character, that I am willing to give a lot more leeway to the mistakes because I'm just having such a good ride. And that isn't an experience I personally get very often.
Do you think that being familiar with source material and being familiar with the author actually helps you take away more of that, because you're getting to experience that character complexity, but the things you know about the author help you sort out, okay, well, I've got to be braced for this might be coming, this is.
And again, it's, obviously really specific to Wheel of Time. I read all the books that were out by the time that I graduated high school in 2001 6 or 7 times. And those are doorstops, and I would just go through them and then start at the beginning again. My spouse has never read a word. We sit there and we watch together, and then I spend basically the length of the episode going, okay, so here's all the things you didn't see, and this is why this happened, and this is why that, and he puts up with it with just incredible grace, which I greatly appreciate. But I have to say that from that perspective, I'm enjoying quite a bit seeing what changes were made, what pivots they found to be necessary, what things I wouldn't have expected, but that improve it. And when I inform him, he is usually likewise pleased. So he's coming at it from a position of complete ignorance to the story. And he seems to be having as much of an enjoyment from that as I do. So maybe.
I was thinking
that's one way. The other way that I end up with this is that we're going to go back to Lord of the Truck again.
Yeah.
I don't find it really particularly restorative to see characters of color playing Klingons, because the Klingon culture itself by canon is problematic and exoticizing. The Romulans themselves are problematic and exoticizing, so that seeing a Black Romulan does not change for me the Orientalist aspect of the Romulan character. It doesn't change the fact that Klingons are some kind of really whacktastic samurai culture pastiche. And so I feel like sometimes We can want the window dressing so badly that we don't look at the armatures that they're being wrapped on. In the same way that, first of all, I watched the Lord of the Rings movies a ridiculous number of times because they came out at a time when I was flush with .com money because I'm old. And I really love the ability to sit in a dark theater and just be wrapped up in a beautiful story. For context, people should know that I was also watching Gladiator and Star Wars Episode 1 at the time. So, you know, anytime anybody wants to put me up on a big pedestal about the media I consume, I love some problematic damn stuff.
So everything that uses that one specific soft light filter, that because I'm not that much younger than you, I wrote a Photoshop macro to drape. It's the everybody look like Jennifer filter.
Maybe I should use that. So the other thing though is that, yeah, I know the Tolkien text really, really well because that was my like mass consumption thing. Because as a linguophile, as somebody who decided I wanted to be a linguist because I'd watched My Fair Lady, um, you know, oh my God, there were these languages and it was great. And this is why I loved Trek, because you know Marco Takuda had done this amazing work fleshing out the languages. Um, I see Lord of the Rings and I oh God, every casting decision they made, and the fact that in the original trilogy there are no brown hobbits by design. And it's not because they didn't have actors. Actors went and they were rejected. And so, contrary to the death of the author, I knew so much about how the casting had been done that some part of me is permanently infuriated. Would I have enjoyed it more without knowing that? Maybe, but the magic of that entire time when we were all consuming Lord of the Rings as it was coming out is we were getting the cast stories, and it was one of the first kinds of social media immediate background. The actors are going to give us snippets of what's going on, as opposed to it having to come from packaged Hollywood once a week Entertainment Tonight kinds of things, or
Right, we have
People magazine.
and we have the
This was very direct and on the internet.
yeah.
And it was like, oh, you know, Viggo Mortensen and his sword and all these other things. So it's a style of consuming the work. And at that point, I don't know that you can actually just go, oh, I'm only going to know about this end and not about that end and disregard things. These are choices we're making. And I find for the most part that people end up in three categories, right? One of which is, oh, I learned a thing. Another of which is, I do a lot of activism in my daily life. I just need to turn my brain off for this. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who is finding myself unable to consume media without having that critical eye on, and so there's fewer and fewer things that I'm willing to turn my brain off for, and it's becoming emotionally difficult, I have sympathy for that position. Or the vast majority of people who are like, well, you know, whatever. And they are functionally the same as the people who are used to generations of stories set in New York that have only white people in them. And the place that it's really become vivid to me recently in the last 10 years is how much I don't know about Islam. Mm-hmm. Because of the bubbles I'm in. I grew up with a lot of proximity to a certain kind of LA Jewishness because of the diverse communities I was in. I learned a certain amount, not nearly as much, about American Blackness. I absorbed deliberately a whole bunch about my own cultural context about being Japanese American, but I'm still learning new things now. Because I was in a suburb and on the edge of things, as opposed to having elders actually surrounding me to tell me these stories. And so I kind of lost my train of thought here, but it matters, these choices we make, and we really, all of us, we find ourselves expecting patterns. I got taught to set up a story so there's a climax and a denouement. When I don't get that, I feel weird. When I see musical pieces that end on a bang instead of like fading off, I feel weird. These are things we've been trained into. It says something about the artist who's made those choices. I don't think that I can just go, oh, I don't know, it's just a piece of music or it's just a book.
I think For me, the decision of whether or not to say, this is super problematic, but I'm going to continue to enjoy my vampire novel because I just really need that popcorn right now, or not. If I know it's coming from a problematic place or from a person who, say, is actively interested in attempting to destroy my life, not specifically me, but everybody like me, I think it is a lot easier for me personally to make the jump to, well, today this will just be media. If my consuming it does not actively benefit that person, for me, so much of the time that's the
Like
cutoff.
Beethoven's not getting royalties.
Right. So while I can recognize him as a problematic person, my choosing to listen to his work on Spotify 40 times doesn't materially benefit him. So if I get in a Beethoven mood, I could do that. I'm presuming there's Beethoven on Spotify.
So,
I think that's a
yeah,
line a lot of people thought is it benefiting? But
I'm going to note that when I'm listening to Beethoven, for instance, I'm going to say, is there a POC orchestra performing Beethoven? Where's his money going to? Oh, that Philharmonic got, dinged for not hiring enough people of color or for harassing a attendee of color to a performance. And I'm just making this up right now. I don't have a particular Philharmonic in mind.
Yeah.
No, I don't. I want to know. I want to know. I want to know where my money's going. I spend a lot of time actually thinking about what I'm funding because it's while we are comforting ourselves with there's no ethical consumption in late stage capitalism.
There's
yes,
also
but
no
does that
ethical
mean you should
carbon
just
offset.
give up? Right? Should you
Right.
just give up? And I think that, you don't just give up. And also, wow, we are in a time of unprecedented depth and breadth of offerings. I read fanfic because it comes with tags, because I know what's going on, because I can go read the comments, and before I even read the chapter, I love spoilers. I love spoilers. I love sites that tell me what's problematic in a thing.
I have started
And
watching
this is how I
cinema
consume things.
therapy for movies before I will watch the movie. To both to tell me if I'm interested in the movie. Like sometimes all I need to do is watch cinema therapy. And now I've gotten everything that I want to out of the movie. But it did every now and then it reminds me that I want to go rewatch something or that I want to watch something. So I did start watching something the other night. Consuming new media does become hard, right? If this is your thing. And you can't proceed on nobody involved with this can ever have been problematic ever. So the question is going to be where you draw the line. And I want to clarify that for me, I don't believe in social justice carbon offsets. I don't believe that you can go to Chick-fil-A and then donate some money to the Trevor Project and have this be okay still.
Right. I mean, my perspective.
There are plenty of queer people who do believe that. The community is not a monolith, but I don't believe that giving money actively to a hate organization is ever justified. That's a hard line for me. Yeah, I don't give my money to Hobby Lobby. I don't give my money to this. But at the same time, like Kat was talking about, well, if you're consuming a work that is problematic, but you genuinely just need some brain popcorn, what do you do? Like, is there a period of time after which you are willing to believe that the author has grown and changed? If you find something out about an author that was problematic that was 20 years ago, can you life of the author or whatever, do you then go and look and say, well, have they changed this position? Are they doubling down? Can you consume
I'm just going to call this out. Can you watch Woody Allen movies? The answer right now is no, I can't. It's because his worldview permeates the stories and they're about him. But he is specifically, I'm mentioning him because there are authors that try very hard to remove themselves from the setting. And there are stories which are very, very much about that author's worldview, right?
Hmm.
If somebody told me that John Irving was a terrible person, I haven't reread a John Irving story in a long time, so I don't know. But I get accused of wanting my creators to be saints and of not having space for product of their time. And to them, my answer is always, you know what? I love Mark Twain.
Hmm.
I read Edgar Allan Poe. They were products of their time, except they weren't exactly only products of their time because each of them was a little bit odd for their time. They were not just steeped in their time, they were trying, right? They were they
Right.
were different.
I think this is something that people do forget about a product of their time. Like if you look at a product of time, let's just throw out, slavery in the US. There were active abolitionist movements that whole entire time that are also a product of their time. Nobody's not saying it's wrong at that time.
Right.
Like it's not like there was no way for them to know.
I
Um,
think
yeah.
going back to the Chick-fil-A. So for me, when I found out about Chick-fil-A's tendencies, cutting them out was no big deal because I thought they tasted awful. I think their chicken is nasty. So it was easy. When I found out that Wendy's was actively keeping slaves to pick their tomatoes,
Did
I
you
never had another
I'm
I never had another Wendy's burger again, but that was hard because we drive 14 hours in a go from Roanoke to Louisiana at Christmas every year to go visit his family. And that was how we broke up the trip. There's a Wendy's here. We can stop there, get a little, snooze in the car a
Well,
little. Wendy's. And
also, what other chain are you going to be indulging in that route? Because
right.
I I go back and forth on Waffle House, right? And
apparently Bucky's pays a living wage.
I had a problem when I had a partner who was from the upper Midwest, and his grandmother, whom he loved and who was really very kind to me, even though she was very much a product of her context, um, had a very limited palate. And so we were going to Cracker Barrel, and this was when Cracker Barrel was like front and center in queer media for being terrible, and front and center in racial justice media for being terrible. And I just, that was hard. Not
Right.
because I love Cracker Barrel,
Right.
but it was it was an agreed upon meeting space.
And
Right.
if you're in the middle of this long slog through the dark and that's the light you have, that's the place you can stop. That's the place you can meet. Having nothing else makes it really difficult to not indulge in that anymore. So,
So I come back to the various ethical precepts that more compassionate cultures have said, which is that if it's life or death, if it is extreme hardship, there's not a necessity to do it. A lot of cultures that have fasting days provide exemptions because it's not healthy. It's
You're
beyond healthy. It
sick,
is it is
you're
it is health
pregnant.
altering for
Yeah.
people in certain circumstances, right? And so I think that there is an invitation to us to be dogmatic a lot, but again, this isn't about seeking perfection. It's about really being aware of one's choices as much as possible, and to make the decisions whenever possible. And possible does not mean in my excuse in my ethos, possible does not mean, well, if you could possibly, by the
Yeah, by any extension of
you know not saying if it's not impossible then do this, but if you can do is a very different place.
mhm,
And so I I spent this last month, because of global context, and November's always a hard month anyway, but because of global context, I found myself having a very difficult time doing anything other than eating cup noodles with augments.
mhm.
And that's just not a sustainable thing to do. And the thing that I really came back to is that this kind of ascetic hardship in an indigenous context, in most cultures that have that kind of sustainability and balance built into them, sometimes you do the hard thing for a limited amount of time because you know that that's the hard thing and you prepare for it. But otherwise, you prioritize what is the ripple going to be, right? And so I grew up in a context where my parents were my father especially was informed by Jim Crow. And so we didn't go to a lot of fast food when we were doing long road trips. My mother spent days making things that were road trip food and we'd be eating out of the cooler. And so that's a thing that has to do with preparation and capacity. And I'm not saying if somebody doesn't have that capacity that they should do it, but those are the other choices we make, right? Because we decide, oh, Wendy's is problematic. Well, now we have a palette of options to choose from, one of which is maybe I'll buy from something else. Maybe I'll decide that the convenience store food is something and I'll have peanut butter sandwiches the whole way. Or maybe you say, I do this once a year. This is not the huge impact. This is not like I have a daily Wendy's habit.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of choices that people make. And I talk a lot about trying hard not to judge people about them. And that's difficult because that ends up often being a rubber stamping carte blanche kind of action. I get asked to provide absolution to people all the time.
Mhm.
And like that, I'm not in the business of doing that. That's between you and your conscience. And I think this really comes down to, as we're living in this current situation, as the world is getting pulled along by people who really want it to come to an explosive end, what are the choices we are going to make and what our consciences compel us to do?
And of course, there isn't any point when you get to say, okay, I've done it and now I'm finished. I mean, there have been creators who I thought were heinous people. And so I did not partake of their material because it put such a sour taste in the back of my throat, who then 15 or 20 years later went, yeah, you know what? I was an a-hole. I'm donating, I'm doing the work, I'm learning. You don't have to read anything that I put out, but I want to acknowledge I was an a-hole. And so then the calculation occurs again. Like, well, okay, maybe I'll give their new stuff a shot.
Right. And I think that's another thing that people fall into a trap of is binary thinking. If a creator was known to be problematic at a point of time and the creator is doing something else now, I'm trying to think of somebody who's an easy example. Like, I mean, Robert Downey Jr.'s alcoholic phase was certainly an example of knowing something about someone that made you hesitant to consume their media. But should that affect your views on whether you're going to go see Iron Man? I think there are other reasons not to see Iron Man. I'm sorry. If I'm gonna pick a billionaire, it's gonna be Bruce Wayne. I'm sorry. I know this is about myself, my problematic thing. But Robert Downey Jr.'s alcoholism is not a reason to not see Iron Man. And like maybe give the author a chance to have grown as a person, maybe give them, but also you still want to approach it with caution, right? Like they are that person, they're gonna have artifacts of that.
But also, just because somebody has stopped doing those things doesn't mean they're not going to screw up again. The question is, what does that mean to have screwed up? Right? I have an essay that I keep going back and forth on whether I'm going to write about Liam Neeson, because in 2019 he said a thing that really pissed me off. But the aggregate of his life is that he's been doing a lot of speaking up about marginalization and about, doing all these other things. And to me, the horror is that because of everything else, everybody wanted to excuse this horrendous thing that he said without initially much consciousness about how horrendous that thing was. For people who are wondering, you can just go Google it, but the capsule summary of it was that he was engaging in a really, really, thankfully, inconclusive but violent effort at collective guilt in a racialized fashion. And that's the way I'm going to phrase that. What do you do with that? I find it really hard to look at him now. and it's sad for me because I've enjoyed a lot of his other work, but I'll come to some resolution about this at some point. Right now, in the midst of a global conversation about collective guilt, it's really hard.
Right. I mean, and I feel
But
like it's such
Anthony Bourdain,
Mm-hmm.
Anthony Bourdain, before he wrote his books and became an international celebrity, and everybody, because Kissinger died yesterday, has been passing around the Anthony Bourdain quote about Cambodia, which is just a powerful piece of writing. But when he was young, he was a feckless junkie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not who he was by the time he was writing.
and I
It's certainly
feel
not who he was as he went around the world and learned to do better and better, because you can watch the progress as he goes through, and you can see certain troughs in his work if you watch it with a completist view, which some of us have. You know, some of his takes are great. Some of his takes, I would want to talk to him if he were still alive.
and that's
Overall,
and that's where we get to a problem, I think, when we make pronouncements of that person did something vile, and so they can never, I will never take in their work again. That's how it is, and you shouldn't take in their work again either, provides no room or impetus for improvement. If they're like, okay, well, this is who I am then, and if we as a culture went, well, you're done then there's no room for improvement. But at the same time,
they have to show willingness to
they have
engage
to show
in
willingness,
restorative justice processes.
and it isn't the
One-
responsibility of the person who is trespassed against to provide them
that one.
Yeah.
with absolution or with room to prove
opportunity
themselves or
or-
opportunity. So it's such a difficult thread for some of this stuff because, on the one hand, we get the sort of people who double down and double down and double down, and you watch them screaming on Twitter and this person will never improve. And if they do, how do they improve to the point where they can crawl out of this hole that they have dug so voraciously for years now? Or you get people who are like, yeah, this is the context that I understand, and so I've said stupid stuff, and I've doubled down on it because when you tell me my stuff is stupid, then I feel like you're saying I'm stupid. If people at that end of the spectrum aren't given the space to improve, then they're just going to end up as screaming hole diggers, I think.
I don't think that it's a question of giving space. I think it's a question of transforming our culture. And by our culture, I mean sort of the global culture that we're participating in as English speakers, and the ways that it influences a bunch of other cultures, where during my lifetime, we've started really emphasizing the multi-part apology.
Mm.
And a lot of what used to happen is that we had a very specific kind of religious context around penance and absolution and redemption. And what I had said to a friend recently was, that's a very specific to a certain religion context, and that's not one that I'm comfortable with. But I do think that encouraging that sense of, oh, a thing that I've done has been pointed out to me. I'm going to go think about this and figure out how I got to that place and how I avoid that place. In essence, right? This is what all of these multi-part apologies are about. I don't think that's up to, we need to make the space for redemption. I think we need to talk about the idea of acknowledging harm as harm to community and harm to the future, and talking about restoration and repair just as a routine thing, because we're in a context where we need to do some drastic repair to how we're engaging with the world for climate and for human rights issues. And that it's not about these individuals who are doing the wrong thing and doubling down, because it is
We're
the
not
culture.
talking about like retribution and redemption. Those are individualist arcs. We're talking about restoration. And for folks who aren't familiar with the context of the multi-part apology, it is essentially not just saying you're sorry, and not just saying you're sorry and doing a penance. It is saying you're sorry, expressing an understanding of why what you did was wrong, and presenting a plan for how that doesn't happen again. It's making space for forgiveness, but not demanding it.
Yeah, the burden cannot be on the person who deserves the apology. The burden.
Yeah.
If they decide, well, that's great for you. I'm glad that you see women as people now. I'm never reading your stuff and I'm never going to talk about your stuff. That isn't an assault on the writer. That's
No.
just what happens when you're an a-hole.
So one of the things that I was asked is, what do you do if the original context doesn't exist for reparations and restoration? And I said, well, I think that all you can do is to go forward and to build a new reputation, and that it's going to be hard. You can't get instant repair on that. Things have to be rebuilt. It's a lot easier to destroy a thing than to rebuild it. And, that's true of everything, right? And that then the question was, well, everybody's always going to know. And I'm like, yes, but I think we need to really prioritize validating the and I learned a thing and I changed, rather than being so obsessed with the steadfastness of never changed, right? We do this to our politicians. We do this in a lot of ways. And then we also have this thing that encourages people to stay in terrible relationships because, oh, how else are you going to get to a 75-year anniversary? I mean, is that really the goal, or is the goal to find ways to create community and a future that isn't that hard? Because not because you've cut out all the hard things and pretending to have a beautiful life, but that you've actually worked in community to say, hey, what if we had step stools for everybody? What if we built ramps? What if we had grab bars in every shower?
What if our party had a retreat room for the introverts? What if, there's every single thing that we do to create community, from these tiny steps that benefit maybe a couple of people to huge steps that benefit wide swaths of people, and everything in between, and huge steps that benefit only a couple of people, but they really need that, and tiny steps that benefits millions and millions of people. Like curb cuts, right? It's just like, how do we make life a little bit easier? We are coming up on time. Does anybody have anything else they want to say about separating the author from the story, keeping the author in the story? Kat, would you like to drop the mic on anything? Jennifer, would you like to say anything before Kat performs her inevitable mic drop?
I will say, just briefly, a definitely occasionally problematic science fiction novel series that I adore and will not name has a quote that I think of with some regularity when I'm having a bad day, which is, if I remember it correctly, the difficulty with oaths of a form such as death before dishonor is that inevitably it separates us all into the dead and the forsworn. Mistakes are gonna happen.
I love that series. And yeah.
And it's about, you've dropped the plate. Okay. Are you gonna dance all over it? Or are you gonna do what you can to mend, move forward, make a better shelf?
I tell my kids all the time, what did we learn from this? We got to clean it up. What are we going to do next? The note I wanted to end on is that I get accused of writing didactic things. And what I've said is, when I'm didactic, I'm didactic. But my fiction, I've had a work in progress for mumble years now. And my framing of the story I'm telling there has changed a lot as I've written other things that are not fiction. Because now I'm not trying to write a fix it for my own heart. I'm not trying to tell a story that hasn't been told. I'm not trying to push a thing. I've come to a place where I'm actually writing a story because I want to explore a thing. And I really want to look at a thing that I haven't seen a lot of. And so I'm doing a lot of consultation. I'm learning. Everything I do is getting absorbed and put into the story. And I would hope that all of that comes through in what I'm writing, and that I find it a little horrifying to think that somebody would want to read this without any appreciation. And I'm not saying, and I've seen people say this, oh, well, you have to appreciate how hard I worked on this. You know, I did all this research, and we're like, it's still problematic. And so when somebody comes to me and tells me, well, that's still problematic, I hope I have the grace to say, oh, crap. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really, really fond of self-publishing and ebooks and more mutable media, because it's really, really easy to get into, well, it's been printed. Well, it's at the distributors. Well, it's in the pipeline and we can't fix it now. And it's one of the reasons I stopped doing sensitivity reads, because I was so frustrated being given the book at the very end of the process and being told, I can't do anything about it.
I
So
did that in my work too. I'll be given something and they're like, well, it's already been through external review. We can't actually change that paragraph. And I'm like, but it's wrong. Like my job is to fact check it and it's wrong. What would you like to do about it now? And they're like, well, it's been to external. And like, why did you hire me? Thanks for the money.
So I hope we can build a culture where we don't try to put authors in a box of good or bad, that we don't say you have to accept the story entirely or you're a bad person for daring to critique. I hope we keep talking about these things. I hope that we build an appreciation for what could happen, that we keep pushing for the things that could be better, could be more nurturing, more sustaining, more diverse, more welcoming. I want to read things published by other people that reflect the world that I've been able, because of a lot of context of my own life, to build around myself, where my commentariat is full of people from all sorts of places. And in the last 3 months, the range of places that people are coming from to my commentariat has expanded. And I don't know what's going to happen. And I hope it's something amazing. Because today I just learned about, I don't know, what was it, 6, 8 different kinds of Arabic calligraphy in time periods that I never would have seen if I didn't have a particular commenter in my space. That's the world I want, and it's the world I want in my media too.
So I think we're gonna wrap there with this reminder. Folks, tag your recommendations. Like this will help you a lot. Not just in terms of, death of the author, but in terms of thinking about what you're ignoring when you consume your media. Think about what tags you would put on this if you told somebody else to read it. What's in it? What's not in it? What's missing? What caveats would you pass this along with? I find myself so frequently saying, I loved this. Here are some things that you might need to watch out for. I have a friend who's very sensitive to body horror. I am absolutely not sensitive to body horror. But I'm like, okay, well, here is a book about immortals, so there's going to be some body horror in it, and here's a book about this. So tag your recommendations, and we will see you next month when we finally make good on our promise to destroy your childhoods. We're gonna ruin it. We're wrecking y'all Hallmark Christmas movies, and talking about what they could be if they were going to actually warm your heart. So see you next month, and thank you again to our panelists for always being awesome. And that's a wrap, folks. Thanks again.